November 29th, 1944, 3:17 a.m., 120 miles off the coast of Japan. Commander Joseph Enright stares through the periscope of the USS Archerfish, his knuckles white against the cold metal handles. His heart pounds in his chest. What he sees defies everything he knows about naval warfare. A ship so massive it blocks out the stars on the horizon. A carrier unlike anything American intelligence has ever documented. And in exactly 47 seconds, he will have to make the most controversial decision of his career. The firing solution is impossible. The angle is forbidden. Every torpedo manual ever written says what he's about to attempt cannot work. But Joseph Enright is about to prove them all wrong. And in doing so, he will sink the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine in human history. If you find this story incredible, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because what happened in those waters that night reads like fiction, but every word of it is true. Leave a like if you want to see more stories about the hidden turning points of history that most people never hear about. Now, to understand why Commander Enright was in that impossible position, staring at that impossible target, we need to go back. Back to the very beginning of the story. Back to a decision made in a conference room thousands of miles away, years before that fateful night. June 19th, 1942. The smoke had barely cleared from the Battle of Midway. Japan had just lost 4 of its premier aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, in a single devastating afternoon. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were dead. And in the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Navy, panic was setting in. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his quarters aboard the battleship Yamato, staring at reports he could barely bring himself to read. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his superiors that he could run wild for 6 months but no more, was watching his prophecy come true ahead of schedule. The war was only 6 months old, and Japan had already lost its carrier advantage. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff convened an emergency meeting. The question on everyone's mind was simple. How do you replace 4 fleet carriers when your shipyards are already stretched beyond capacity? The answer came from an unexpected source. Deep in the massive dry dock at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, a hull was taking shape. Hull number 110. It was supposed to become the 3rd Yamato-class battleship, sister ship to the mightiest warships ever built. The Japanese had already laid down 64,000 tons of steel, armor plate, and structural framework. The ship was nearly 40% complete. Vice Admiral Keiji Fukuda proposed the unthinkable. Convert her. Turn this half-finished battleship into an aircraft carrier. The debate lasted 3 days. Converting a battleship hull into a carrier had never been attempted on this scale. The engineering challenges were immense. The Yamato-class hulls were designed to withstand 16-inch shells, not to launch aircraft. Everything about their design philosophy was wrong for carrier operations. But Japan had no choice. The shipyards couldn't build new carriers fast enough. And they had this hull, this massive foundation of steel, just sitting there. On July 7th, 1942, the order came down. Hull number 110 would become an aircraft carrier. They would name her Shinano, after an ancient Japanese province known for its mountains and its warriors. What nobody realized at the time was that they were creating a ship that would hold a tragic record for all of history. The conversion began immediately. Workers swarmed over the hull 24 hours a day. Welders worked in shifts around the clock, their torches casting orange light across the massive dry dock. Engineers redesigned compartments that had been intended for 16-inch gun magazines into aviation fuel bunkers and ammunition storage. The distinctive Yamato-class bulbous bow remained, but everything above the waterline would be transformed. The scale was unprecedented. When completed, Shinano would displace over 72,000 tons at full load. Her flight deck would stretch 840 feet, longer than 2.5 football fields laid end to end. She would be the largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. A record that would stand until the 1960s, when the United States launched the nuclear-powered USS Enterprise. But the conversion was plagued with problems from the start. The original Yamato design featured an intricate honeycomb of watertight compartments. This design had saved Yamato's sister ship, the Musashi, during the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, where she absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes before finally sinking. That extraordinary resilience came from over 1,100 watertight compartments. When engineers tried to convert this structure for carrier operations, they ran into an impossible puzzle. Aircraft elevators, hangar decks, aviation fuel lines, and munitions hoists all required cutting through those compartments. Every modification compromised the watertight integrity that made the Yamato class nearly unsinkable. The workers tried their best. They installed new watertight doors throughout the ship. But quality control suffered under the impossible deadlines. Many doors were never properly fitted. Some wouldn't close completely. Others weren't tested under pressure. And then there was the concrete. In a desperate attempt to provide protection against bombs and kamikaze attacks, engineers poured over 17,000 tons of concrete into the ship's structure. This added enormous weight but questionable defensive value. Worse, it raised the ship's center of gravity, making her less stable in heavy seas. By late 1944, the war situation had deteriorated catastrophically for Japan. American submarines roamed the Pacific almost at will. B-29 bombers had begun their devastating raids on the home islands. The Philippines were falling, and the Imperial Navy was hemorrhaging ships faster than anyone could count. Shinano still wasn't finished. Captain Toshio Abe received his orders in early November. He was a veteran naval officer, respected by his peers, known for his cautious and methodical approach. The orders he received went against every instinct he had. Move Shinano from Yokosuka to Kure immediately. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal sat in Tokyo Bay, increasingly vulnerable to American air raids. Kure, on the inland sea, offered better protection and had the facilities to complete Shinano's fitting out. The logic was sound. But Shinano wasn't ready. Her crew had been aboard for only weeks. Many of her watertight doors had never been tested. Her pumps hadn't been calibrated. Her damage control parties hadn't trained together. Half her anti-aircraft guns lacked trained crews. Captain Abe requested a delay. His request was denied. American bombers had just struck Tokyo again. Another raid was expected within days. High Command was terrified of losing their greatest carrier before she ever saw action. The order stood. On November 28, 1944, at 6 p.m., Shinano cast off from Yokosuka. She was accompanied by 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze. Her crew numbered 2,400 men, most of whom had never served on a carrier before. In her holds were 50 Oka rocket-powered suicide planes, piloted missiles designed for kamikaze attacks against the American fleet. Captain Abe set a course south, planning to round the Izu Peninsula before turning west toward the inland sea. He ordered a speed of 18 knots, fast enough to make good time, slow enough to conserve fuel. The night was clear, too clear. A 3/4 moon hung in the eastern sky, casting silver light across the water. Visibility was excellent, perfect conditions for spotting enemy aircraft, but also perfect conditions for being spotted. On the bridge, Captain Abe stood watching the sea ahead. He was a man of 53 years, his face weathered by decades of salt spray and Pacific storms. He had commanded destroyers at the Battle of the Java Sea. He had seen friends die at Midway. He understood, perhaps better than most, how quickly fortune could turn in naval warfare. His executive officer, Commander Yasuma Nakamura, approached with the latest weather report. Seas moderate, Captain. Wind from the northwest at 12 knots. Barometric pressure stable. Abe nodded, but didn't take his eyes from the water. Something felt wrong. He couldn't identify it. A captain's instinct honed by 30 years at sea. The night was too quiet. The voyage was going too smoothly. Double the lookouts, he ordered, and have the anti-submarine team run another sweep. Yes, Captain. Below decks, the crew settled into the rhythm of a ship at sea. In the engine rooms, sweating stokers fed fuel to the hungry boilers. In the massive hangar bays, aviation mechanics checked lashings on aircraft that had never flown from this deck. In the crew quarters, young sailors wrote letters home, not knowing they would never be delivered. Seaman First Class Takeshi Yamamoto, no relation to the famous admiral, was 17 years old. He had joined the Navy 6 months earlier, full of patriotic fervor and dreams of glory. Now, standing watch on the port catwalk, he stared out at the moonlit sea and tried not to think about submarines. Everyone knew about submarines. The American underwater fleet had been strangling Japan for 2 years. Supply ships disappeared without trace. Tankers exploded in the night. Even the largest warships weren't safe. The carriers Taiho and Shokaku had both been torpedoed that summer. Takeshi gripped his binoculars tighter and scanned the horizon. Nothing. Just empty water and endless sky. He had no way of knowing that death was already watching him from beneath those waves. What Captain Abe didn't know was that his ship was already being watched. 400 miles to the south, Commander Joseph Enright had his own problems. The USS Archerfish was a Blau-class submarine, 312 feet long, displacing just over 1,500 tons surfaced. She was small, cramped, and running low on fuel after 6 weeks on patrol. Her crew of 65 men had seen plenty of action, but no major targets. Life aboard a submarine in 1944 was a study in controlled misery. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and recycled oxygen. Bunks were stacked 3 high, so narrow that a man could barely turn over. Fresh water was rationed so strictly that showers were a distant memory. And always, there was the knowledge that a single mistake could send everyone to the bottom. Chief Petty Officer John Williamson had served on 4 submarines during the war. At 32, he was one of the oldest enlisted men aboard. He knew every sound Archerfish made, the groan of her hull under pressure, the whir of her electric motors, the subtle vibration that meant the starboard shaft bearing needed attention. That evening, he was in the forward torpedo room, checking the Mark 14 torpedoes for the 100th time. Each fish weighed 3,000 pounds and carried enough explosive to blow a hole in any ship afloat. But they were temperamental weapons. Early in the war, their magnetic detonators had failed so often that submariners called them fish, not in an affectionate way. "You think we'll see anything tonight, Chief?" asked Torpedoman Second Class Michael O'Brien, a 20-year-old from Boston who was making his first war patrol. Williamson shrugged. "Captain says the shipping lanes are empty. Japanese don't send anything through here anymore. Too many of us waiting." "Then why are we still here?" "Because orders are orders, kid. And because sometimes luck finds you when you're not looking for it." O'Brien would remember those words for the rest of his life. And Commander Enright was haunted by a ghost. 1 year earlier, almost to the day, Enright had been in command of the submarine USS Dace. He had encountered the Japanese carrier Shokaku, one of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The geometry was perfect, the shot was clear, and Enright had hesitated. The torpedoes missed. Shokaku escaped. Enright had been relieved of command shortly after, officially for rest and recuperation. Every submariner in the Pacific Fleet knew what that really meant. It had taken months for Enright to get another command. The brass had given him Archerfish, reluctantly, a second chance that most believed he didn't deserve. This patrol was supposed to be his redemption. Instead, it had been 6 weeks of empty ocean. November the 28th came with routine monotony. Archerfish cruised on the surface, her diesel engines charging batteries, her radar sweeping the empty sea. The crew went about their duties with the mechanical efficiency of men who had long stopped hoping for action. At 8:48 p.m., everything changed. Radar operator Harold Eddy straightened at his console. "Contact," he announced, his voice carefully neutral. "Bearing 270, range 24,000 yards. Enright was in the conning tower within seconds. He studied the scope, watching the blip pulse on the green display. Something about the return was wrong. "That's a big contact," he muttered. "Too big for a destroyer, maybe a cruiser." He called for battle stations. Men scrambled to their posts, throwing off exhaustion like an old coat. Within minutes, Archerfish was alive with purpose. Enright decided to pursue on the surface. His submarine was faster than any Japanese warship when running on her diesels. She could make 20 knots to their 15 or 18. The plan was simple. Race ahead of the contact, dive to periscope depth, and set up an ambush. But the contact wasn't cooperating. Over the next 2 hours, the radar blip behaved erratically. It would hold a steady course, then suddenly zigzag. Speed varied from 12 to 18 knots. The escorting destroyers weaved unpredictably around the main target. This wasn't normal behavior. Japanese warships typically followed predictable zigzag patterns, changing course at regular intervals. This formation seemed almost random. At 11:30 p.m., Enright got his first visual. He climbed to the bridge, raised his binoculars, and felt his breath catch in his throat. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the water, and silhouetted against that light was a ship unlike anything he had ever seen. The flight deck stretched impossibly far. The island superstructure rose like a small building. Even at maximum range, the sheer scale of the vessel was apparent. "Oh my God," Enright whispered. "What is that?" His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Sigmund Bobchinski, had joined him on the bridge. Bobchinski had served in intelligence before transferring to submarines. He studied the distant shape for a long moment. "Skipper, I think that's a carrier. A big one. Maybe the biggest I've ever seen." Enright felt the old fear rising in his chest. Another carrier. Another chance to fail. Another opportunity to prove that his critics were right about him. He pushed the fear down. This time would be different. This time, he would not hesitate. "All ahead flank," he ordered. "We're going to get ahead of her." What followed was one of the most remarkable chases in submarine warfare history. For over 4 hours, Archerfish pursued Shinano across the Pacific. The submarine pushed her diesel engines to their absolute limits, hammering through the moderate seas at nearly 21 knots. Spray crashed over the bow. The hull groaned with the strain. In the engine rooms, machinists' mates watched temperature gauges climb toward the red line, praying the engines would hold. Commander Enright stayed on the bridge the entire time. His eyes were raw from salt spray and wind. His hands were numb from gripping the bridge rail. But he never looked away from that distant silhouette on the horizon. Around him, the bridge watch crew maintained their own vigil. Quartermaster Robert Dunlap handled the helm, keeping Archerfish on a precise intercept course. Signalman Third Class Edward Pinkston swept the horizon with night binoculars, watching for any sign of the escorting destroyers. And always, the radar operator's voice came up through the speaking tube. calling out ranges and bearings. Target bearing 275, range 19,000 yards. A target bearing 278, range 18,200 yards. They were gaining. Slowly, painfully, nautical mile by nautical mile, they were gaining. Meanwhile, Captain Abe was growing concerned. His radar operators had detected the pursuing submarine hours ago. The blip appeared and disappeared as Archerfish rode the swells, but there was no mistaking what it was. An American submarine, running on the surface, clearly in pursuit. Standing orders were clear. When a submarine was detected, immediately increase speed to maximum and continue zigzagging until the threat was lost. But Shinano couldn't reach maximum speed. Her engines, never properly tested, were running rough. Some of her boilers weren't fully operational. The engineering officer, Lieutenant Commander Sado Miwa, had warned before departure that the propulsion plant needed at least another week of trials. His warnings, like so many others, had been ignored. The best Shinano could manage was 18 knots, not fast enough to outrun a surfaced submarine, not slow enough to let her slip behind. On the bridge, Captain Abe weighed his options. Each choice carried risk. Each delay brought the enemy closer. Abe faced a choice. He could turn toward the submarine and attempt to ram it, a tactic that had worked before but risked damage to his untested ship. He could release his destroyers to hunt the submarine, but that meant losing his escort screen. Or he could maintain course and hope his zigzag pattern would make a torpedo solution impossible. He chose the third option. What Abe didn't know was that his zigzag pattern was actually helping Archerfish. Every time Shinano turned away from the submarine, she opened the distance between them, but every time she turned back toward her base course, she closed that distance again. The net effect was that Archerfish, despite her slower sustained speed, was actually gaining ground. The geometry of pursuit worked against Shinano in another way too. To reach the inland sea, she had to maintain a generally southwestern course. This meant she couldn't simply run away from Archerfish. She had to keep coming back toward the submarine's patrol area. By 2 a.m., Enright realized he had a chance. "We're gaining on her," his navigator reported. "At this rate, we'll be in firing position within 2 hours." But the moon was setting. Dawn was approaching. And once the sun rose, Archerfish would have to submerge. A submarine on the surface in daylight, anywhere near Japanese air cover, was a submarine about to die. Enright had to force a confrontation before dawn, and he had to do it without letting Shinano's destroyers get a clear run at him. At 2:30 a.m., he made his move. Instead of pursuing from behind, Enright ordered a bold course change. He would cut across Shinano's projected track, gambling that her next zigzag would bring her directly toward him. It was a desperate gamble. If he guessed wrong, the carrier would slip past him and escape. If he guessed right, he would be in perfect position for a shot. For 47 agonizing minutes, Archerfish raced through the darkness. Enright stood on the bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the distant carrier weave back and forth across the moonlit sea. At 3:14 a.m., Shinano began another turn. Toward Archerfish. "Dive!" Enright shouted. "Take her down to periscope depth." The klaxon screamed. Men scrambled down hatches. The submarine's bow tilted as her ballast tanks flooded. Within 90 seconds, Archerfish had vanished beneath the waves. Enright was at the periscope before the dive was complete. He spun the scope toward the target bearing, pressed his eye to the rubber cup, and watched the greatest warship he had ever seen come steaming directly toward him. The problem was immediately apparent. Every submarine commander learned the same lesson in torpedo school. The ideal firing angle was perpendicular to the target. You wanted the enemy ship to cross in front of you, presenting her full length. A 90-degree angle meant the torpedoes had the shortest distance to travel, and the target had the longest profile to hit. Shinano wasn't crossing in front of Archerfish. She was coming almost directly toward her. Enright ran the calculations in his head. The angle was approximately 23 degrees off the bow. The torpedo manual stated that any angle less than 45 degrees was marginal. Anything less than 30 degrees was considered prohibited. The torpedoes would either miss entirely or strike at such a glancing angle that they wouldn't detonate properly. 23 degrees was suicide. But Enright knew something the manual writers didn't. He had spent his months of disgrace studying every torpedo report from the Pacific War. He had analyzed the geometry of successful attacks, and he had discovered something that contradicted the official doctrine. The prohibited angles weren't impossible. They were just difficult. The manual had been written before the new Mark 14 torpedoes with their contact exploders had been properly calibrated. The old rules didn't account for modern weapons. A skilled captain, with steady nerves and perfect timing, could make the shot work. Enright turned to his torpedo data computer operator. "Set depth at 10 feet, speed high, spread of 1 degree. "Sir?" The operator's voice cracked. "The angle..." I know the angle. Set the solution. The seconds stretched like hours. Through the periscope, Enright watched Shinano grow larger with terrifying speed. He could see details now. The flight deck crowded with aircraft, the island superstructure bristling with guns, the bow wave crashing white against the darkness. She was magnificent, the most beautiful and terrible warship he had ever seen. And in 30 seconds, she would pass too close for him to miss. Final bearing and shoot, he said, his voice steady. All tubes ready, sir. Solution set. Outer doors open. Fire one. The submarine shuddered as the first torpedo left its tube, propelled by a blast of compressed air, then another, then another. Fire 6. In 18 seconds, Archerfish launched 6 Mark 14 torpedoes at the largest warship afloat. Enright kept his eye pressed to the periscope, counting the seconds. Torpedo run time at this range was approximately 50 seconds. 50 seconds to know if he was a hero or a failure. The first torpedo struck at 3:17 a.m. Aboard Shinano, the explosion was catastrophic. The Mark 14 warhead contained 643 pounds of Torpex, a mixture of RDX, TNT, and aluminum powder that was 50% more powerful than TNT alone. The blast tore a hole 30 feet wide in Shinano's starboard side, below the waterline, forward of the island structure. Seaman Takeshi Yamamoto was thrown against the bulkhead by the impact. For a moment, he lay stunned, unable to comprehend what had happened. Then the second explosion came, and the third, and the fourth, and he understood. They were being torpedoed. Before anyone could react, 4 massive waterspouts had erupted along the ship's starboard side. Alarms were screaming, men were shouting, and thousands of tons of seawater were pouring into the mightiest carrier Japan had ever built. In the forward engine room, Chief Engineer Lieutenant Yokoyama was performing routine checks when the first torpedo hit. The lights went out instantly. A moment later, the emergency lighting flickered on, revealing a scene of chaos. Steam pipes ruptured, men screaming, and a wall of water advancing through a shattered bulkhead. "Seal the compartment!" Yokoyama shouted. "Get those watertight doors closed." His men tried. They pulled the levers. They spun the wheels. The doors moved 6 inches and jammed. Debris from the explosions had warped the frames. The doors that had never been tested under pressure were failing at the worst possible moment. Water poured through the gaps, cold, merciless, unstoppable. Yokoyama grabbed a junior officer and pushed him toward the ladder. "Go! Report to the bridge. Tell them we're flooding uncontrollably." The young man scrambled up the ladder. Yokoyama stayed behind, trying to organize his remaining men, trying to salvage something from the disaster. He was still there when the water reached the overhead. He was one of the first to die. He would not be the last. Captain Abe was thrown from his feet by the first impact. By the time he regained his stance, 4 massive waterspouts had erupted along his ship's starboard side. Alarms were screaming, men were shouting, and thousands of tons of seawater were pouring into his command. 2 of Enright's 6 torpedoes had missed, but 4 had found their mark. The combined explosive force had ripped open Shinano's hull along a length of over 200 feet. Under normal circumstances, even this devastating damage might not have been fatal. The Yamato-class design featured extraordinary compartmentalization. The ship should have been able to contain the flooding to the damaged sections, while damage control parties worked to shore up the bulkheads. But Shinano was not a normal ship. The watertight doors that should have sealed automatically jammed or failed to close at all. The pumps that should have countered the flooding were operating at a fraction of their capacity. The damage control parties, untrained and unfamiliar with their ship, arrived at the wrong compartments with the wrong equipment. And the concrete. That 17,000 tons of concrete that was supposed to protect Shinano from bombs now became a death sentence. As the starboard side flooded, the weight of the concrete prevented the ship from rolling back to an even keel. Instead, she listed further and further to starboard, her deck tilting like a sinking table. Captain Abe tried everything. He ordered counterflooding to port, but the valves wouldn't respond. He ordered all aircraft pushed overboard to reduce topside weight, but the deck crews couldn't work on the tilting, spray-soaked surface. He ordered full speed ahead to ground the ship in shallow water, but his engines were losing power as seawater entered the boiler rooms. Aboard Archerfish, Commander Enright had turned his submarine away and was running for deep water. He didn't know if the carrier was sinking. He could hear the rumble of destroyers overhead, the distant explosions of depth charges. For the next several hours, Shinano's escorts would hunt for the submarine that had just wounded their greatest warship. They never found her. The sun rose on November 29th to reveal a scene of absolute catastrophe. Shinano was listing 30 degrees to starboard. Her flight deck, that vast expanse of wood and steel, was tilted so steeply that a man couldn't stand on it without holding a railing. Water was lapping over the edge of the hangar deck. and deep in her hull, the flooding continued unstoppably. At 10:18 a.m., Captain Abe finally gave the order to abandon ship. The words echoed through the intercom system, or what remained of it. Many speakers had been damaged by the explosions. In some compartments, men never heard the order. They stayed at their posts until the water took them. On the listing flight deck, chaos reigned. Hundreds of sailors struggled to launch life rafts that had never been tested. Some rafts inflated properly. Others burst or refused to inflate at all. Men began jumping into the water without life jackets, preferring the chance of the open sea to the certainty of a sinking ship. Commander Nakamura, the executive officer, organized what rescue efforts he could. He directed men toward functioning lifeboats. He cut lines to release jammed equipment. He pulled a young sailor back from the edge when the boy, in his panic, was about to jump into the spinning propeller. "And not that way," Nakamura shouted. "The other side. Go to port." By then, chaos had already consumed the carrier. Hundreds of men had jumped into the water hours earlier. The destroyers were already pulling survivors from the sea, and still the great ship refused to die. The destroyers Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze circled the stricken carrier like worried dogs around a dying master. Their crews threw lines to swimmers, hauled exhausted men over gunwales, and watched in horror as the largest carrier in the world slowly surrendered to the sea. Lieutenant Masao Yoshida, commanding the rescue operations aboard Yukikaze, would later describe the scene as beyond nightmare. Men covered in oil, men with terrible burns, men who had lost friends, brothers, fathers in the flooding compartments below, and above it all, the impossible sight of Shinano, that massive, magnificent ship, tilting further and further toward oblivion. For another hour, Shinano wallowed in the swells, her massive hull somehow staying afloat despite the thousands of tons of water inside her. Men who hadn't jumped clung to railings and gun mounts, watching in horror as their ship slowly surrendered to the sea. Seaman Takeshi Yamamoto was among those still aboard. He had been helping other men into life rafts when the last one launched without him. Now he stood on the tilting deck, gripping a stanchion with both hands, watching the water rise. He thought about his mother in Osaka. He thought about the letters he had written that would never be sent. He thought about the dreams of glory that had brought him here, to this moment, on this dying ship. When the final roll began, Takeshi closed his eyes. At 10:57 a.m., almost 8 hours after the torpedo strikes, Shinano finally went down. She rolled onto her starboard side with a groaning, tearing sound of metal that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. The great flight deck, longer than 2 football fields, rose vertical against the gray morning sky. For a moment, she hung there, impossibly tall, impossibly doomed. Then she slid beneath the waves. 1,435 men went down with her. Among the dead was Captain Toshio Abe, who had chosen to ride his command to the bottom rather than face the shame of survival. Shinano had been in commission for just 10 days. Her maiden voyage had lasted 17 hours. She had never launched a single aircraft in combat. And she remains, to this day, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. When Commander Enright returned to port, he wasn't sure anyone would believe his report. A carrier of 70,000 tons, sunk by a single submarine, at a firing angle the manual said was impossible? Archerfish pulled into Guam on December 10, 1944. The crew was exhausted, but elated. They knew they had accomplished something extraordinary. But without confirmation, their claims sounded like fantasy. The debriefing officers were skeptical. They demanded details. They pored over Archerfish's torpedo data records. They calculated and recalculated the firing geometry. They questioned Enright for hours about the target's size, its profile, its behavior during the chase. Commander William Irvin, the senior intelligence officer at Submarine Force Pacific, studied Enright's drawings of the target. The dimensions made no sense. No Japanese carrier matched that profile. The size was impossibly large. "Are you certain about these measurements?" Irvin asked. Enright nodded. "I looked at that ship for 4 hours through binoculars and another 30 minutes through the periscope. I know what I saw. What you're describing would be the largest carrier in the world." "Yes, sir, I know." For 2 weeks, intelligence analysts searched through every piece of information they had on Japanese naval construction. Radio intercepts, aerial reconnaissance photos, agent reports from inside Japan. Nothing mentioned a carrier of this size. Then, on Christmas Eve 1944, a coded message was intercepted from Japanese naval headquarters to the combined fleet. The message referenced the loss of Shinano and ordered strict censorship of all information related to the incident. Shinano, a name that appeared in no Allied intelligence file. The codebreakers at Station Hypo went to work. Within days, they had pieced together enough fragments to understand what had happened. The Japanese had converted a Yamato-class battleship hull into an aircraft carrier. They had kept the project so secret that even their own fleet commanders didn't know about it. And a single American submarine, using an angle that shouldn't have worked, had sunk her on her maiden voyage. And then, slowly, they began to understand what Enright had accomplished. The forbidden angle had worked precisely because it was unexpected. Japanese damage control doctrine was built around the assumption that torpedo attacks would come from the beam, from the side, where the target profile was largest. The Yamato-class armor and compartmentalization was optimized to resist perpendicular impacts. But Enright's torpedoes had struck at a 23-degree angle. Instead of hitting discrete compartments, they had raked along Shinano's starboard side, opening a continuous wound that the watertight doors couldn't possibly seal. The very doctrine that should have protected the carrier had been turned against her. Enright was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in combat. His crew received combat citations. Archerfish became one of the most celebrated submarines in naval history. But more importantly, the attack vindicated Enright's belief that the old rules could be broken. In the months that followed, other submarine commanders began attempting shots at angles that had previously been considered impossible. The victory percentage improved. More Japanese ships went to the bottom. One man's refusal to accept conventional wisdom changed the entire doctrine of submarine warfare. The story of Shinano doesn't end with her sinking. For decades after the war, the full truth remained hidden. Japan refused to acknowledge that their greatest carrier had been lost so quickly and so embarrassingly. The ship's existence was classified. Survivors were forbidden to speak of her. In America, intelligence analysts pieced together fragments of the story from intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations. But without Japanese confirmation, the full picture remained unclear. It wasn't until the 1960s that the complete history emerged. Japanese naval archives were finally opened. Survivors began to tell their stories, and the world learned just how close Shinano had come to changing the war. If she had reached Kure safely, Shinano would have been completed within months. Her massive flight deck could have operated over 100 aircraft. Her armored hull could have absorbed punishment that would sink any other carrier. She would have been the centerpiece of Japan's final desperate naval resistance. But a submarine commander with a second chance, using an angle the manual said was impossible, changed everything in 17 hours. There's a final detail to this story that most people never hear. When Shinano was launched, before her conversion was complete, a young Japanese engineer named Hiroshi Suzuki stood on her deck and made a prediction to a colleague. "This ship is not ready," he said. "She will never be ready, and if they rush her to sea, she will die." Suzuki tried to warn his superiors. He filed reports about the untested watertight doors. He documented the problems with the pumps. He noted that the damage control parties had never trained together. His reports were ignored. His concerns were dismissed as defeatism. He was transferred to another project and told to keep quiet. After the war, Suzuki became one of Japan's leading naval architects. He designed ships for the new Maritime Self-Defense Force, and he never stopped talking about Shinano. "She was a beautiful ship," he wrote in his memoirs. "But beauty is not enough. A ship needs to be ready. Her crew needs to be trained. Her equipment needs to work. Everything else is just metal and dreams." He died in 1987, still haunted by the ship he couldn't save. Commander Joseph Enright lived until 1995. He retired from the Navy as a captain, having served with distinction for another decade after the war. He rarely spoke publicly about Shinano, though he corresponded with historians who wanted to understand that night in November 1944. In one letter, written shortly before his death, he reflected on the moment he decided to take the shot. "Everyone told me the angle was wrong," he wrote. "The manual said it was wrong. Common sense said it was wrong. But I had spent a year thinking about that missed shot at Shokaku. I knew that sometimes the wrong choice is the only choice you have, and I knew that hesitation was the only unforgivable sin. So I fired, and I changed nothing in that moment except everything that came after." The Pacific Ocean keeps her secrets well. Shinano lies in over 20,000 feet of water, far deeper than any salvage operation could reach. Her exact position was lost for decades, known only from rough calculations based on Archerfish's navigation logs. In 1993, a joint American-Japanese expedition attempted to locate the wreck using deep-sea sonar. They found nothing conclusive. The seafloor in that region is rough and broken, scarred by underwater earthquakes. If Shinano is down there, she's buried in silt and debris, invisible to any technology we possess. Perhaps that's fitting. The greatest carrier of her time, built in secrecy, sunk in darkness, lost forever to the depths. But her story lives on. Every submarine officer learns about the Shinano kill. It's taught in naval academies around the world as an example of what happens when doctrine fails and what happens when courage succeeds. The forbidden angle has become a case study in thinking beyond the manual. And somewhere, in the cold darkness of the Pacific, a 72,000-ton monument to hubris and heroism rests on the ocean floor. A reminder that in war, nothing is impossible, not even sinking the unsinkable. The lesson of Shinano isn't just about submarines and carriers. It's about the danger of rushing into battle before you're ready. It's about the cost of ignoring warnings from people who know what they're talking about. It's about what happens when institutional pride overrides common sense. Captain Abe knew his ship wasn't ready. The engineers knew the watertight doors hadn't been tested. Everyone involved understood the risks of sending an incomplete carrier to sea in submarine-infested waters. But the fear of American bombers, the pressure from high command, the desperate hope that speed could substitute for preparation, all of these combined to seal Shinano's fate before she ever left port. In business, in military affairs, in personal life, the Shinano story repeats itself again and again. Organizations rush products to market before they're ready. Armies deploy equipment that hasn't been tested. People make life-changing decisions before they've thought them through. The result is always the same. Not immediately, not always catastrophically. But eventually, the untested door fails. The untrained crew panics. The unconsidered risk becomes an unsurvivable reality. Shinano could have been the greatest carrier of World War II. Instead, she became a cautionary tale. And 4 torpedoes, fired at an angle that should have been impossible, wrote the final chapter of her story. Joseph Enright never forgot the sight of that massive ship through his periscope. In interviews decades later, he still grew quiet when asked to describe the moment when the largest warship he had ever seen came steaming out of the darkness, directly toward his tiny submarine. "Fear is a funny thing," he said once. "It can paralyze you, or it can clarify things. In that moment, everything became simple. There was the ship, there were my torpedoes, and there was the choice. Take the shot or let her go. I had already let one carrier go. I couldn't do it again. So I took the shot. And somehow it worked. Somehow it worked." 4 words that summarize one of the most improbable victories in naval history. A submarine commander with a failed past, a firing angle that contradicted every rule in the book, a carrier that should have been unsinkable, and a moment of courage that changed everything. That's the story of USS Archerfish in Shinano. A story of hubris and heroism, of rushing and readiness, of forbidden angles and impossible victories. A story that proves, in the cold arithmetic of war, that nothing is ever truly impossible, not even sinking the unsinkable. On the memorial wall at the United States Submarine Veterans Memorial in Groton, Connecticut, there's a plaque dedicated to the crew of USS Archerfish. It lists their patrol record, their victories, their service to their country. But the words that matter most aren't on the plaque. They're in the water, in the deep Pacific, where a massive ship lies broken on the ocean floor. The crew of Archerfish never needed words. Their torpedoes spoke for them. And history listened. This concludes the story of how one submarine commander, taking a shot that everyone said was impossible, sank the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine. But the Pacific War had many more stories like this one, stories of courage and sacrifice, stories of desperate gambits and impossible odds, stories of ordinary men doing extraordinary things in the crucible of combat. If you want to hear more of these stories, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next video. And remember, in history, as in life, the impossible is only impossible until someone does it. Commander Enright proved that on November 29th, 1944. What impossible thing will you prove today? The waves still roll across the Pacific, the same waves that carried Archerfish to her rendezvous with destiny, the same waves that closed over Shinano's broken hull. Somewhere down there, in the crushing darkness, the greatest carrier of her age still waits. A monument to what happens when pride meets preparation, and a reminder that the sea keeps her secrets. But not forever. Never forever. The USS Archerfish survived the war. She served through 1968 before being decommissioned and sold for scrap. Her hull was broken up in San Francisco, her steel recycled into civilian use. Nothing physical remains of the submarine that achieved the greatest single kill in submarine history. But her legacy endures. Every modern submarine commander knows her name. Every torpedo officer studies her attack. Every naval historian remembers what happened in those cold waters off the coast of Japan. Archerfish proved that courage and skill could overcome any odds, that the manual is a guide, not a prison, that sometimes the forbidden angle is the only angle that works. She proved that one submarine, with one determined commander and one desperate gamble, could change the course of history. And she proved that in the darkest moments of the Pacific War, American sailors were capable of extraordinary things. That's the legacy of Archerfish. That's the lesson of Shinano. And that's a story worth remembering. Because in the end, that's what history is. Not dates and battles and statistics, but stories, human stories. Stories of people facing impossible choices and finding the courage to make them. Commander Joseph Enright made his choice on November 29th, 1944. He took the forbidden shot. He sank the unsinkable ship. And he wrote himself into history forever. The question now is, what will you do with your impossible moment? When the choice comes, and it always comes, will you hesitate? Or will you fire? The sea is waiting. History is watching. And somewhere in the deep Pacific, Shinano lies silent. A warning. A lesson. And a testament to what one determined person can accomplish when they refuse to accept that something is impossible. Fire when ready. History will sort out the rest.